Sorry about the mess, but let's paint. Today I wanted to talk about something very basic, and that's measuring with your pencil. Learning to draw is all about learning to see objectively. And any trick that we can employ to aid our eye will go a long way. And as you can see here, we have a simple still life. And I'm just going to get started by gesturing it in. Gesturing is really just about scribbling very tentative marks. It's really just about throwing in your first impression. Just get something down on the page, even if it's wrong, and then start to work with it. Now, what I'm doing here is actually gesturing in the negative space, not the figurative space, because we want to start with the flattest, largest information in our composition, and that's the basic distinction between background and figurative space. But now that we have something down on the page, we can start to check our proportions. For instance, just by glancing at this, I get the feeling maybe this bottle's too small compared to everything else. So what we're going to do is compare the width of our skull to the width of the bottle. And the way we can do that is by using the tip of our pencil as one end of a measurement and slide our thumb along the pencil for the opposite end, like so. See, I can place the tip of my pencil to one side of that bottle and slide my thumb right up to the other side, and now I've captured a unit of measurement. One thing you want to be very careful about is that your elbow is locked at all times. If it's bent, then there can be deviation from the measurement that I captured just based on how close or far away this pencil is from my face. So you want to lock your elbow to keep things consistent, and you want to try and keep your shoulder as still as possible. In fact, if you need to move this measurement around, bend at your waist. So we can measure the width of the bottle and count out the width of the skull in these units. 1 2/3. So the skull is about 1 2/3 as wide as the bottle. And that's important to remember. These are comparative measurements. They're not absolute measurements. Sometimes I see students doing this. And that's a telltale sign that they don't get it. You can't transplant measurements from the subject to the drawing. You would end up with a tiny little postage stamp sized drawing every time. What we're doing is creating a ratio. This compared to that. So what we said was 1 to 1 2/3. So we can do the same process with our drawing. If my bottle is this wide, then my skull needs to be 1 2/3 wide. So there's 1, and you see this is more than 2. So it's definitely the case that the bottle is too small compared to the skull. So let's enlarge that a bit. Just a little bit. All right. And in fact, we can compare the width to the height of the bottle just to make sure that we're satisfied with the proportions of that before we move on. So if I measure out the width of that bottle, capture a unit for the width, and then turn that on its side, I can begin here where I see the base of the bottle with 1, 2, 2 2/3. So let's check our drawing. Our width was 1, so let's start down here with 1, 2, and that's way more than we need. So let's go with our first instinct here for the base of the bottle and try it again. 1, 2, 1, 2, and let's draw the mouth of the bottle there. That would be 2 2/3. All right, so now that the height versus the width of the bottle feels good, notice that now that I've expanded the bottle a bit, my negative space in between my skull and the bottle has gotten more narrow. So let's use that negative space to gauge the width of this space to the bottle. So I'm going to measure the negative space as my unit and compare that to the bottle. That's 1, 2, 1, and 2. So the bottle is basically twice as wide as the negative space. Let's check it. So 1, 2, 1, and 2, and nowhere near the amount of space I need. So let me make this negative space a little bit wider at this point here. And you see me gesturing pretty dark, and that's really just so you can see on your TV or computer. Normally gesturing is done very light. It only needs to be as dark as you need it to be to see it as the artist. So let's try that again. 1, 2, 1, and 2. Almost. We're almost there. Let's just shave a little tiny bit more off. And again, this is what gesturing is really all about. It's not about erasing, it's not about correction, it's about taking what you've already laid down on the page and working with it. So we pretty much need to see where we've been to figure out where we need to end up. So now I've widened my negative space from here to here. Now I'm going to compare it. 1, 2, 1, 2. All right, that feels pretty good if the side of my bottle is about here. And you see, as we progress in our gesture, we slowly make our marks darker and darker. So that's good. I feel good about this negative space and the width of this bottle. Now again, let's compare the width of the bottle to the skull. I always find that it's best to start with your shorter distance, using that as your unit of measurement, and comparing that to the larger distance. So again, capture my unit of 1 for the width of the bottle, compare that to the skull, and it measures 1 and 2/3. 1, 2, 1, and roughly 2/3. Good. All right, our measurements are checking out now. I'm confident in the width of my bottle, at the body, the width of my negative space, and the width of my skull now. Let's work out the proportions of the width of my skull compared to the height of the skull. So let's capture a unit for the width and compare that to the height, starting here at the jaw. 1 and a little less than a half. So if that's 1, 2, 1, and a little less than a half. Good. Our first instinct was a good one. All right, I'm feeling good with the proportions of my skull. Last but not least, let's start working out a little bit of information for our hand. Now, there's an incline around here for that hand, and we can work out what angle that incline is at by using our pencil as a horizontal gauge. So you want to make your pencil as perfectly horizontal to your perspective as you can get it, and then lower that right down to the tip of that finger. And you can make out a wedge that you've made between the mapping line of your pencil and the diagonal of that hand. So if our mapping line was about here, that's what our pencil was marking, then the wedge we're creating between that horizontal mapping line and the back of the hand looks sort of like that. Alright, we can add the curves for the knuckles and all the subtleties to that edge later, but for right now it's best to look at the overall geometry to ensure that you have the structure based well. And now that little bit of negative space tapering in to my composition for the bottom of the lips of that bottle is starting to look more like what I'm seeing in the still life. Alright, again we have another angle for that wrist. We can check that angle in the same way, this time using a vertical alignment. We can bring that gauge right up to the tip of that wrist and see what kind of wedge it makes. And based on that mapping line, firstly I see that this wrist comes out quite a bit from the side of my bottle. And if my mapping line is here, then the wedge it makes against the side of that wrist sort of looks like that. Alright, so we've got roughly the width of this hand worked out. Let's work out the proportions of that hand, height versus width. So let's measure from the knuckle of the thumb to the knuckle of these fingers here. Use that as my unit. So that's 1 compares to 1, 2. Pretty good. So 1 to 2 ratio. So I need to find any unit that will fit exactly 2 across the width of this hand. Let's try this. 1. Pretty good. We'll go with that. So from that knuckle down about here, the knuckle of my thumb should be about there. Alright, great. Now, the last thing I want to check the proportions of is the bottom. There's a body and a neck. So right now, before we deal with that neck, we know we want it to end about right there, but exactly how wide and where the neck should begin, we don't quite know yet. Now let's use our pencil as a horizontal mapping line to see where the height of the skull crosses the body of that bottle. And what I can see is that a mapping line extending from here would mark the point on the bottle where it actually has begun to curve up. And there's quite a bit more of the body of that bottle above that mapping line. So you can use your pencil to measure distances. You can also use your pencil to gauge out horizontal and vertical mapping lines as well as angles. Now let's get the proportions of the neck of that bottle to the body. So let's measure the neck and compare that. Let's just compare that to the width rather than counting out too many units. The fewer units the better. So across the width of that bottle I can count out 1 and about 2/3. Let's see if we have the right idea here. 1 and about 2/3. I can live with that. Great. So now we know that the mouth of the bottle belongs up there, but before we jump the gun on that, we want to make sure our bottle is nice and symmetrical. And the only way to do that is to gesture through forms. That's one element of a gesture. You need to draw as if everything is transparent. You need to follow through overlapping objects. So, if I divide this ellipse in half to the best of my ability, I get a center point for that ellipse. And if I extend it straight up to create a midline for that bottle, first thing I can do is make sure that the two sides of that midline are symmetrical. And that checks out. And now I have a good idea of where the ellipse for the mouth of my bottle belongs, because I want that to be in line with the midline of the bottle. And as you start measuring out the major proportional relationships, then you start to become more free to eyeball the rest. Now this label is falling on an ellipse, and I want to make sure that it conforms to the volume of this bottle. So I'm going to draw myself an ellipse as a guide. Again, remembering the gesture is completely transparent and you need to draw through overlapping forms. So that gives me a good idea where that back label would be. And it also ensures that the curving top edge of this label looks like it's stuck to the surface of a cylinder. All right. Now, when it comes to hands, I like to start with sort of a mitten, marking the roundabout figure ground. And once you have that mitten, you can cut out the negative space. I find the most successful way to draw hands is to render the negative space in between those fingers rather than the figure space of the fingers themselves. That's an easy way to avoid getting puffy sausage fingers, you know. So I'm going to draw that negative space as I'm seeing it. And simply by virtue of cutting out that negative space, I'm defining the edge of my figural space. But one thing that's important to note about the gesture is you don't want to go overboard with it. You don't want to describe way too much detail in it. The gesture is really just intended to get very basic scale and proportion. Now I'd like to know where the brow of my skull belongs compared to the cranium. So let's measure the height of that forehead from the eye socket up to the top of the skull, and then compare that to the overall height of my skull. So that's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Conveniently enough. So I need to find some measurement that I can fit 3 units of along the height of the skull. 1, 2, not enough. Let's make it a little longer. 1, 2, 3. Almost there. 1, 2, 3. Pretty good. So this should be the height of my forehead. That means my eye sockets belong right about here. Now how about the width of the eye sockets? Let's use that space in between the eye socket and the back of the skull as my unit. So if that's my unit of 1, let's just measure across the skull. That's 1, 2, 3, a little bit more than 3. Let's try this. 1, 2. That's good. Let's go with that. So the side of my eye socket belongs right here. All right. I do believe that would be enough to help us get started Well, thanks for watching. If you want to see more episodes, like and subscribe. If you'd like to suggest topics for future episodes, leave a comment down below. And I'll see you next time on the next episode of Sorry About the Mess, but Let's Paint.